The human arrived at the conclave of 17 worlds carrying a handful of dirt. Not metaphorically, not as ceremony. Yusuf Murin stepped off the transit pod onto the Cathara station's reception deck with a sealed sample case in one hand and a travel satchel in the other, and before he acknowledged the assembled delegates, before he located his assigned observer, before he did anything that the conclave's intake protocols specified, he crouched. He pressed his bare palm flat against the deck plating. The Cathara station was a living structure, grown over 6 decades from a seed organism the size of a transport vessel. Its walls were secreted chitin composite, its floors a compressed mycelial lattice, its atmosphere maintained by the respiration of 10,000 cultivated organisms distributed through its infrastructure like a circulatory system. It hummed. Not acoustically, the station produced almost no sound, but in the bioelectric register that the Cathara perceived as naturally as humans perceived color. The whole station sang in frequencies of living chemistry. SSS Civil read the human's arrival through that register. She was the conclave's assigned field reader for the human delegation, a role that carried roughly the prestige of being asked to catalog sediment. The humans were 12th of 12 applicants for inclusion in the agricultural exchange. They had been ranked by the conclave's automated prestige index before they'd even docked, their technology submissions reviewed, their cultivation methods assessed, their yields calculated against the synthetic and biological baselines of the other 11 civilizations. 11th, the index had returned. Then, after a secondary pass, 11th again. The index had no category low enough to place them 12th, so it had simply declined to rank them at all. The VETH delegation had found this enormously satisfying. Their representative, Chick Harrell, had produced a sound from the plates of his thorax that SSS Civil had learned to recognize as laughter, a dry, percussive crack like stressed carapace. Several of his subordinates had echoed it. SSS Civil had not laughed. She had been watching the human, and something in what she observed did not fit the category she had prepared for him. He was still crouching, his palm was still on the deck, his eyes were closed. The Cathara around him shifted, a collective ripple of bioelectric unease, the equivalent of exchanged glances. The human was performing no protocol she recognized. He was not greeting, he was not signaling rank or intent, he was simply touching the floor with concentration, as though the floor were telling him something. After 11 seconds he stood. He was not a physically impressive specimen by the standards of most species in the conclave chamber. Medium height for a human, which placed him below average for 6 of the 12 delegations present. His skin was a deep brown, weathered at the hands and neck in ways that SSS Civil's research files attributed to long-term solar exposure. He had worked outside then under an actual star, which already placed him in a category that most conclave members would find either quaint or alarming. He wore practical clothing. He carried the sample case with the specific care that SSS Civil associated with fragile biological specimens. He found her in the crowd, she was not certain how, given that she looked essentially identical to her colleagues by human visual standards, and walked to her directly. "You're my observer," he said. His translator rendered this in standard conclave acoustic. "Field reader SSS Civil," she confirmed, her own translator working the other direction. "I am assigned to document your delegation's activities during the summit." "Just me," he said. "The delegation is just me." She had known this, she had not expected him to say it without apparent discomfort. He set the sample case down and opened it. Inside, resting in a series of sealed atmospheric containers, were soil samples, 12 of them, each one a different color: black, red, pale gray, deep ochre, the dark brown-green of something that had once been a living forest floor. The scent that escaped the case when he opened it was entirely outside SSS Civil's olfactory experience: complex, layered. Ancient in a way she could not have explained in her own language, and could only gesture toward in the conclave's trade tongue. Several of the nearby delegates shifted further away. "What is the purpose of the organic material?" asked one of the Cathara arbiters, his bioelectric field flickering in the pattern that indicated professional tolerance of the inexplicable. Yusuf picked up one of the containers. He held it to the station's bioluminescent light, a soft blue-white glow that the station's sealing organisms produced continuously, and looked at the dark matter inside with an expression SSS Civil would spend the next 3 days trying to correctly classify. "Everything that ever lived is in here," he said. He was not speaking to the arbiter, he was not speaking to her, he was speaking to the dirt. SSS Civil filed her first report that evening. Subject does not respond to social diminishment. Cause unknown, monitoring. What she did not include, because she had no professional language for it, was the reading she had taken from his bioelectric field in that moment. The Cathara perceived emotional state through the faint electrical gradients that all organisms produced, a leakage of the internal into the external, as reliable as chemistry. Most delegates in the conclave chamber were producing the complex, layered fields of social performance, managed anxiety, calculated confidence, displays calibrated for audience. The human was producing nothing of the kind. His field was quiet, settled, warm in the register that SSS Civil associated with organisms in their preferred habitat. He was, as best she could interpret it, content. She did not know what to do with this. She catalogued it and moved on because the conclave's schedule did not pause for anomalies, and there was a reception that evening at which she was required to monitor him, and the Veth were already requesting that the Prestige Index run a third time to confirm the human's ranking, and Chick Harrell was audibly suggesting to 3 other delegations that humanity's application be reviewed for procedural deficiencies. She found Yusef at the reception standing at the edge of the room, eating something he'd produced from his own satchel rather than sampling the conclave's provided nutrition. He was watching the other delegations interact with the same quiet, cataloging attention he'd given the floor of the docking bay. "You should be networking," she told him, "building coalition support, the vote on your application." "I know," he said. He offered her the thing he was eating. She declined. Her species absorbed nutrition through a different mechanism entirely. He ate the rest of it without looking at it. "What's the floor made of?" She told him the mycelial lattice, the growth history, the maintenance cycle. He listened with an attention that felt to SSS Civil disproportionate to the topic. When she finished, he nodded slowly as though confirming something. "Monoculture," he said quietly, not to her. She would remember that later. The sabotage happened sometime in the station's dark cycle, while the bioluminescent sealing organisms dimmed to 30% output and most of the delegates were in their assigned quarters. Yusef discovered it the next morning. She was already in position to monitor him when he opened the sample case and began his daily check of each container. He opened the first one and went still. He opened the second, the third. He worked through all 12 containers with the methodical patience of someone performing a task that required completion regardless of what it revealed. Then he closed the case, stood up, and was quiet for a long moment. His bioelectric field did something she had never recorded in any species she had monitored. It contracted. It didn't spike. There was no surge of distress, no flood of alarm chemistry. It pulled inward, became very small, very dense. She had, in her research files, a description of what certain deep ocean organisms did when threatened. They compressed themselves, reduced their profile, became essentially invisible to predators by making themselves into the minimum possible version of themselves. She had always understood this as a physical response. She was beginning to think it might also be a cognitive one. He didn't shout, that was what frightened her. He didn't shout, that was the first thing that frightened her. SSS Civil had monitored 43 diplomatic delegations across 19 summits. She had watched the Veth discover trade fraud, the Cathara arbiters rule against populations of millions. A Lurin navigator lose their vessel's entire data archive to a system failure. She knew the bioelectric signature of shock. She knew grief, rage, the complicated electromagnetic weather of devastation. She had catalogued them all. What Yusef Murin produced was none of these things. He opened each sample container and smelled it. She watched his face. Humans were extraordinarily legible through facial musculature, another thing she was still adjusting to, and what she saw there was not anger or despair. It was attention, pure, clinical, almost inhuman attention. He was assessing damage the way a physician assesses a patient, not to feel something about it but to know something about it. 3 months of cultivated specimens, 12 soil ecosystems, each representing a different Earth biome, each containing thousands of microbial species that he had spent years selecting, nurturing, and preparing for exactly this presentation. The Veth's chemical agent, she had already identified it from her atmospheric sensors, a broad-spectrum microbicide used in Veth sterilization processes, had done its work thoroughly. The samples were, by any standard assessment, dead. He closed the last container. 3 of them might have survivors, he said. He was not speaking to her. He had not yet acknowledged that she was in the room with him, but the translator rendered it anyway. The deep samples, anaerobic colonies if the agent didn't penetrate all the way down. He set those 3 containers aside. Then he went to the conclave arbiters and requested a 48-hour procedural delay in access to the station's basic growth medium stores. He did not accuse the Veth. He did not present his chemical analysis. She knew he had one because she had watched him run the sensor scan and the results were unambiguous. He simply said that his materials had been compromised and that he required time to address the issue. His voice was level. His field was that same compressed density. The arbiters allowed it. The procedural grace period was a formality they extended because denying it would have created more paperwork than granting it. They clearly expected him to fail. Chick Harrell made a statement to 4 delegations within the first hour. The human's primitive biological methods had proven inadequate even to preserve his own materials under standard station conditions. This was taken, broadly, as confirmation of what the Prestige Index had already suggested. Yusef was not present for this. He was in his quarters in the middle of converting a standard-issue conclave nutrition tray into a microcultivation surface. SSS Civil observed him through the room's environmental monitoring systems. She had been granted continuous observation access as part of her field reader mandate, and she watched him work with the focused, unhurried efficiency of someone who had performed variations of this task 10,000 times. He was cross-cultivating, taking the surviving microbial colonies from the contaminated samples, identifying them under a portable scope, selecting viable strains, transferring them to fresh medium with an instrument so fine she had to zoom her monitoring feed to confirm it was real, and building upward from essentially nothing. He worked through the first meal period without stopping. He worked through the conclave's afternoon session, at which Chick Harrell gave a formal address on the superiority of molecular synthesis over biological cultivation, a presentation that drew significant applause from 7 delegations and which SSS Civil had been required to attend. She kept her monitoring feed open on a secondary channel. Yusef was still working. He worked through the evening reception, the secondary arbitration session, the Lurin music performance that 3 delegations had been anticipating for weeks. At the 14th hour, she went to his quarters herself. She told herself it was because her monitoring feed had limited resolution at fine scale and she needed direct observation data. This was partially true. He was at his work surface, his back to her, bent over a cultivation tray with the portable scope. The room smelled of the station's standard atmosphere plus something else, warm, biological, faintly sweet, the metabolic exhaust of living things doing the work of living. She entered, he didn't turn. "You should be in metabolic rest," she said. "Probably," he agreed. "Your species requires sleep. Prolonged deprivation causes cognitive." "I know what it causes." He adjusted something on the scope. "I've got maybe another 4 hours before the curve drops. I need to see where this is headed first." She moved around the table so she could see what he was observing. The cultivation tray held 6 sections, each one a different substrate. In the rightmost section, she could see, faintly at the edge of perceptibility, a bloom of microbial activity, a living edge, barely wider than a line, green, dark, and fragile. It was almost nothing. By any quantitative measure, it was almost nothing. He was looking at it the way she imagined. She had no personal referent for this, but the concept existed in her research files, the way humans looked at their offspring. "How did you know which strains would survive?" she asked. "I didn't." He leaned back from the scope finally and looked at her directly. His eyes were red-edged with exhaustion. "I knew which ones I'd given the best chance. That's not the same thing. You spend enough time with a system and you start to learn what it wants to do, what it's trying to do even when something's working against it." He paused. "You stop trying to force outcomes and start learning to read tendencies." She processed this. "That is not a scientific method." "No," he agreed, "it's older than that." At hour 19, he held the tray to the light, the bioluminescent glow that the station's ceiling organisms produced at reduced output during the dark cycle. The living edge had widened, still fragile, still almost nothing, but real. He exhaled, a long, slow breath that his body had apparently been storing for some time. He set the tray down with a care that seemed, to SSS Civil, structurally identical to the way the Cathara placed sacred objects in their bonding ceremonies, not because she had data confirming this, but because the precision of the movement communicated value in a way that transcended species difference. Then he reached into his satchel and ate something without looking at it, and continued working. She transmitted her amended report at hour 20, "Subject does not stop. not due to mechanical error, not due to chemical compulsion, reason unclassified. Note, previous classification of low yield is under review. The 48 hours passed. Yusef presented his surviving cultures to the arbiters, not the full 12-biome demonstration he had planned, but 3, rebuilt from near extinction, showing active microbial succession across artificial substrate. It was, by the conclave's quantitative metrics, insufficient. The arbiters noted this without enthusiasm. Chick Harrell moved immediately. The formal motion for humanity's exclusion on grounds of technological insufficiency was filed within the hour, co-signed by 4 delegations. The vote was set for 2 days hence. And then the station began to die. Not dramatically, not all at once. The first sign was a discoloration in the hydroponic bay's secondary beds, a pale yellowing at the root tips of the Cathara's cultivated food organisms, the slow withdrawal of color that SSSivil associated with mineral deficiency or pathogenic stress. The station's automated systems flagged it as a low-priority maintenance issue. By the following morning, it was not low priority. The pale yellowing had spread to the primary beds. The root tip discoloration had become root tip collapse, the fine structure of the feeding hairs dissolving, the plants above withdrawing nutrients from their extremities in the slow, terrible logic of organisms trying to survive by sacrificing their periphery. The station's food supply for 600 delegates was in cascade failure, and the automated systems had no model for the organism causing it because the organism had never appeared in any Cathara database. It had come from Earth-adjacent space. It had arrived on a human trade vessel months ago, carried in a pocket of atmospheric contamination that no one had flagged because it had matched no known pathogen profile. It was, in the register of SSSivil's most precise professional terminology, humanity's fault. And the only person in the conclave who had ever seen anything like it was the human farmer sitting cross-legged on the floor of the hydroponic bay, his palm pressed flat against the root substrate, his eyes closed, his field producing that dense, compressed warmth that she was slowly learning to recognize as something her species had no word for. She had asked him what he was doing. He had said, listening. The station was hungry, and no one knew how to feed it. SSSivil stood at the hydroponic bay's monitoring station and watched the cascade data scroll across her field, not a visual display, but the bioelectric map that the Cathara infrastructure broadcast continuously, every living system in the station producing its own electromagnetic signature, the whole structure readable to her as a kind of weather. She could feel the bay dying. It was a specific sensation, like watching a fire go out, not the dramatic extinguishing but the long, slow cooling, the gradual dimming of something that had been warm. The station had grown these beds over 60 years. The organisms in them had been selected and cultivated across generations of Cathara agricultural science, refined to an extraordinary efficiency, each species chosen for its compatibility with the others. They fed 600 delegates and the station's permanent population of roughly 2,000. Their reserve nutrition supply, synthesized and stored, would last 12 days. The pathogen consuming the root beds had, by SSSivil's estimate, 8. She had been present when Yusef identified it. He had been crouched at the root substrate for 4 minutes before he stood, and he had not used his portable scope. He had used his nose. I know this, he said, not with satisfaction, with the particular heaviness of recognition that carries bad history behind it. He had described what it was in terms that required 3 translation passes to render into conclave standard. A fungal organism, not quite matching any Cathara taxonomy because it had evolved in a different ecosystem, but following a logic he knew. It exploited monoculture, moved through uniform plantings the way fire moved through dry grass, because there was nothing to interrupt it, nothing in the genetic neighborhood that it hadn't already learned to consume. The Cathara hydroponic system, optimized to extraordinary efficiency, had become a single vast meal. The conclave's engineering team had listened to him. They had then consulted their own models, confirmed that his identification was probably correct, and rejected his proposed solution. He had suggested companion planting, introducing other species into the root beds to break up the monoculture, disrupt the pathogen's advance, create biological interruptions it couldn't cross. He had suggested a targeted microbial counteragent, specific organisms that preyed on this class of fungal pathogen, drawn from his surviving soil cultures, the ones he had rebuilt from near extinction over 19 sleepless hours. The engineering team's objection was not unreasonable. The station's hydroponic system was integrated, a single interconnected biology, decades in the making. Introducing foreign microbial agents into a stressed system carried real risk of secondary collapse. They had no model for how his counteragent would interact with the station's existing microbiome. Their simulations showed three possible outcomes, of which one was recovery, one was stable degradation, and one was accelerated total failure. "Your solution might save us," the lead engineer told him, her bioelectric field carrying the specific frequency of a being who genuinely wished it were otherwise. "It might also kill the station in 4 days instead of 8. "That's correct," Yusef said. "Then we cannot authorize it." "That's also correct," he said, and went back to the root beds. He had been there for 2 hours now. SSS Civil had remained. She told herself she was observing. She was not certain this was entirely true. He worked methodically through the bay, moving from bed to bed with his sensors and his scope, and she was increasingly convinced. Some additional instrument she had no name for, a quality of attention he brought to root structure and substrate composition that went beyond what his equipment could measure. He was reading tendencies. He had told her this was older than science, and she was beginning to understand that he had meant it literally. This was knowledge carried in hands and memory, transmitted across human generations not through data files but through practice, the way the Cathara transmitted certain chemical recognitions not genetically but through early environmental exposure. She was gradually understanding, doing something that his civilization had been doing for 10,000 years. He was just doing it on a space station in a crisis with a hostile conclave watching. Chikharol had arrived in the bay 20 minutes ago. He stood at the monitoring perimeter with 2 members of his delegation, and his bioelectric field was producing a very specific signature, the VETH equivalent of careful, calculating patience. SSS Civil had documented this field state before. It meant he saw an opportunity. The human's counteragent is derived from the same trade vessel contamination that introduced the pathogen, Chikharol said to his delegates, loudly enough to be heard across the bay. Humanity has poisoned the conclave and is now proposing to administer the cure, the precedent this sets for membership eligibility. The pathogen was an accident, SSS Civil said. She had not intended to speak. The words had simply occurred to her with the force of a correct measurement. Contamination events are documented in 14 of the 17 member species admission records, including the VETH. Chikharol's chitin produced a slow, deliberate crack. The field reader has opinions. The field reader has data, she said. From the root beds, Yusef's voice, SSS Civil. She moved to him. He was crouched at the far end of the bay at the substrate junction where the primary and secondary systems connected, the oldest part of the installation, where the original growth medium had been seeded 60 years ago. He was looking at the roots. "Sit down," he said. She sat. It was an unusual posture for a Cathara in a professional context. They communicated status partly through vertical positioning, but something in his tone indicated that this was not a social request. It was logistical. At this level, this close to the substrate, the bioelectric field of the dying root system was overwhelming. She had been perceiving it from a distance as a generalized signal, a weather system. Down here it was a language, specific, detailed. She could feel individual organisms in distress, the chemical gradients of their dying, the places where the pathogen advanced and the places where, faintly at the edges, the root system had been trying to resist it. "You can read it," he said. He wasn't asking, he'd watched her face. "Yes." "Show me where it's slowest, where it's been slowest from the beginning." She scanned. The map built itself in her perception, the advancing gray of pathogenic consumption, and beneath it the texture of the resistance. She found it, 3 locations in the secondary beds where the fungal advance had stalled, where for reasons she hadn't examined the root density was slightly higher and the monoculture slightly less uniform, places where decades ago, a different strain had been introduced for an experiment and then incompletely removed. She pressed her sensing appendage to the substrate and let the electrical gradient flow through her, then told him. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "The Irish famine, do you know that story?" "I have access to human historical records," the summary. "Not the summary." He sat back on his heels. His eyes were fixed on the substrate, but he wasn't looking at it. He was looking at something she didn't have the visual apparatus to see. In the mid-19th century, by our calendar, the island of Ireland had a population of about 8 million people. They survived primarily on a single crop, the potato, one variety of potato. He paused. A fungal pathogen not unlike what's in these beds swept through the country. The monoculture had no resistance. A quarter of the population died, another quarter emigrated. The island took a century to partially recover. She processed this. This is a historical cautionary example I have. We did it again, he said. Different crops, different regions, different centuries, the Dust Bowl, the Panama disease, coffee leaf rust. We had the same lesson available to us every time, and we kept organizing our food systems for efficiency rather than resilience. He picked up a small tool and made a careful incision in the substrate, just deep enough to expose the root structure beneath. The smell that rose was complex soil chemistry, fungal metabolite, and beneath it something faintly sweet that she associated with the microbial cultures in his sample case. We kept doing it because efficiency feeds more people in the good years, and in the bad years. He didn't finish the sentence. She sat with this for a moment. She was reading his bioelectric field as she always did, cataloging, and what she encountered was something she had not expected to find in a professional diplomatic context. She found grief. Old grief worn smooth by time, the kind that had been carried so long it had become structural, load-bearing, integrated into the architecture of how he thought. He was not offering her a theory. He was offering her a scar. The exclusion vote, she said. If you fix this, Chick Harrell loses the coalition. He knows that. He will not allow you access to the station's systems. I know, he looked at her, you have access. I am not authorized to grant station system access to unapproved personnel. I know that too. She looked at the substrate. She looked at the cascade data in her field, the advancing pathogen, the dying beds, the slow arithmetic of a station running out of time. She thought about the 3 locations in the secondary beds where the advance had stalled, where an old experimental contamination had accidentally produced the diversity that was now, imperfectly, holding a line. She thought, accident creates resilience. She thought, this is what he has been trying to tell me for 3 days. She stood. She moved to the maintenance panel on the far wall of the bay, the one that controlled physical access to the root corridor, the internal infrastructure of the station's hydroponic system, the place where the biology of the station was most directly accessible and most directly vulnerable. She pressed her appendage to the authorization surface. The panel opened. She said nothing. She did not look at him. She heard him stand. She heard the sound of a sample case being lifted with that particular care. She heard his footsteps move past her and into the corridor. She transmitted her report at hour 3. Subject has entered root corridor with biological materials. Access granted under FieldReader Emergency Observation Protocol. Note, this protocol does not technically exist. Note, creating it now. She stood at the mouth of the corridor and listened to him work. She could feel him in the bioelectric field, a warm, focused, human-shaped presence moving through the root system of the station, making small adjustments, introducing things, taking readings, moving on. Like a physician making rounds. Like a farmer walking his fields in the early morning before anything else was awake. At hour 12, something changed in the field. Not dramatically, not a cascade reversal or a sudden clearing, more like a hesitation. The pathogen's advance, which had been moving with a terrible metronomic regularity, became uneven. It slowed at one edge, then another. The root system in the secondary bed sent out a signal she interpreted as the bioelectric equivalent of a sharp intake of breath, startled, almost, by the presence of something new in the medium. The conclave's monitoring systems registered it simultaneously. She saw the engineers check their displays, check them again. In the station's main assembly chamber, she knew Chick Harrell had called an emergency session. He had a prepared motion. He had a coalition. In the root corridor, Yusef Murin was still working. She walked to where he had set his travel satchel beside the maintenance panel. She had not looked at it before. It was not her mandate to inventory his personal materials. But she had noticed, when he had lifted the sample case and walked past her, that the satchel had been left behind. And she had noticed because she noticed everything that it was not empty. She looked at it without touching it. It contained a long, flat case separate from his scientific equipment. Old, the material it was made from was not the same as the rest of his luggage, darker and textured in a way that suggested age rather than wear. The case was perhaps a meter in length. She had his mission documents. She had reviewed them completely, as was standard for a field reader. They did not mention this case. They listed his scientific materials, his cultivation equipment, his sample cultures. They did not mention anything a meter long in a case that looked older than his career. She read his bioelectric field through the walls of the corridor, still working, still warm, still certain. Then she looked at the case again. In 12 hours, the emergency session would convene. In 12 hours, the fungal advance would either have slowed enough to prove his method viable or it would not have. In 12 hours, Chick Harrell would stand before the conclave with his motion, his coalition, and his careful, patient opportunity. SSS Civil filed her report and waited. She did not know precisely what was in the long, flat case. She had, however, been reading humans for 3 days now, and she was developing, she thought, some capacity for the work. She was learning what it meant when the field went quiet instead of spiking. She was learning what old grief looked like when it had been turned into purpose. She was learning that when a human set something down carefully in a room and walked away from it, they had not finished with it. They were just not finished with it yet.